Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the Atlanteans in Age of Mythology Retold, to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses. Now of course this is going to vary dependent on the major god you're picking and even the minor gods you're picking, but the Atlanteans are all about making trade-offs. They do have a significant amount of strength, but they also do have some fairly substantial weaknesses that you have to contend with when you are playing them. So let's consider the situation with the Atlanteans and maybe some of the reasons I think people are struggling at the moment to kind of make them work. Like, I think the meta at the moment is certainly dominated by Odin, Set, Isis, the Greeks in general. Atlanteans seem kind of behind that for a number of reasons, though keep in mind the meta is always evolving and we're still early days. Like, once people have put in thousands of hours into the game, it is going to be a lot different than at the moment when you have at most hundreds of hours. Even like people who are constantly playing this game, I sincerely doubt like even the rank 1 players have put 1,000 hours, or maybe they have, but just about there. It's going to be different 2,000, 3,000 hours. It's going to be different with balanced patches, of course. But even without balanced patches, you got to consider that the meta is evolving. So let's talk about one of the significant strengths and the trade-offs of it for the Atlanteans. The significant strength is that every single unit and their gatherers can become heroes. So hero gatherers, hero citizens as they're called, hero marshmallows, arcus, etc. This is a very substantial benefit with some trade-offs, but the substantial benefit is that unlike the Greeks, who have to get dedicated heroes to deal with myth units and they're limited in numbers, unlike the Egyptians, where priests are only good at dealing with myth units and not much else, or the Norse, who do have more useful hero units, but they're not going to be trading against human soldiers quite as well. Their heresiers and Godis are just expensive compared to, things like berserkers, huskarls, throwing axemen, etc., or jarls. So you are making those kind of trade-offs. Whereas for the Atlanteans, the biggest benefit for their heroes is the fact that they remain good against what they were good before, right? So archers are still going to be good against human infantry, and they're just going to get a substantial benefit against myth units. Hero citizens become much better gatherers. Hero oracles give you more favor capability, and all heroes except citizens can pick up relics. So that is a substantial kind of benefit that the Atlanteans do have. The trade-off, there's two of them. One is the cost, because it is expensive to get these guys. Two, the time, because it takes some time to actually transform these units into heroes. So those are two trade-offs. I would say the Atlanteans do end up being superior in this respect, but they also do have problems as a result of it, like the economic cost. You do have a fairly powerful economy with the Atlanteans, but you don't have dedicated heroes that are just good against myth units. You have all-purpose heroes. So the way I would say it is Atlantean heroes are better against dealing with human soldiers than you might see in other civilization aspects. Yes, you can talk about Polyphemus, Belfron, all that, but in general, I would say Atlantean armies are better at dealing with human soldiers while still retaining a good anti-myth unit capability, but they might not be the strongest at dealing with myth units, because dedicated anti-myth units are obviously going to be better at that. So that would be my perspective with it. But of course, you do have various upgrades that you can get, like frontline heroics that can be really good, well, like Oceanus. So that is fairly substantial to consider. And also, there's other upgrades you can get for heroes like Hyperion regenerating HP. So you don't have inherent HP regeneration. Keep those aspects in mind. But in general, you're not sacrificing general purpose capability to just deal with myth units, but you're also not necessarily gaining the same kind of strength to deal with myth units. On the flip side, your gatherers are flat out the best in the game, by far. So Atlantean citizens and Atlantean citizen heroes are significantly better at gathering resources, construction times than anyone else. One significant benefit with citizens is the fact that they don't need the drop-off point. So you don't have to worry about getting ox carts. You don't have to worry about constantly producing drop sites. This not only saves you a lot of resources in a game, in any kind of game, but also saves you a bunch of micromanagement so you can focus on other things when you're building up your economy. The downside is the training time is significant, so it's much longer than for others, and they're more expensive. Though honestly, considering the gathering rates on citizens, it is actually a worthy trade-off, but it also means that any citizen that you get is and lose is going to hurt you more than losing a gatherer for another civilization. They are far more durable, but you do have that downside that you do have to be aware of with these citizens. It's all about those kind of trade-offs when you're dealing with the Atlanteans. You do have an economic guild that's dedicated for all your research, so you just get one of these like you would get an armory. But this is kind of where we start getting into some of the problems that the Atlanteans have. See, it is great to have an economic guild that handles all of your upgrades. It is great to have a house, or rather a manor, that just provides better, and depending on the major god you're picking, can give you certain certain benefits. Like if you're considering, Kronos over here, giving you 25% faster construction. That is all very well and good. However, and there is a big however in this situation, the problem with manors, they're very freaking expensive. Far more expensive than for other civilizations. They also take longer to construct. So if we look at, say, the Norse house, right? It's 15 seconds, 45 wood, like ignore Loki for a moment, right? So 45 wood. Or free for the Egyptians. Free houses. Or if we look at the Greeks, 50 supports 10 population. Whereas you do have the most expensive manors. They can allow you to garrison units. That is a nice benefit, but the construction time and cost can hurt you. So this is one of the principal issues, I would say, with the Atlanteans. Overall, their strength is there. Like, I don't think anyone disputes that the strength is there. But 1v1 games at the moment, at the very least at the moment with current balancing, it's so much about that early aggression, so significant about that early aggression, that being slowed down, like having to assign a worker that's going to take a while to get, houses, that's going to take a while to get those economic guilds and all that, it can slow you down in certain ways. So that is a downside. Also, having less gatherers, so having less construction workers, means you may have less flexibility in terms of what you're doing with them, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of construction. Yes, the speed is there, but numbers do count as well. So don't underestimate that aspect, because when you have fewer and you have to micromanage all of them individually and each of them is more impactful, that can end up hurting you. So I think like Atlanteans can be a bit more difficult to master than other civilizations, even if seemingly they appear as if they are a civilization that should be easy, but in reality, because you have less gatherers, your stuff is more expensive in terms of houses, your units are also not cheap either, for the record, and a lot of units are not necessarily general purpose except Marmillos and Fanatics, which are a tier 4 unit. That can be tricky. Another thing worth mentioning as a downside for the Atlanteans is the way their siege works. They do have good siege. Like destroyers, pretty good having, an infantry unit that's good against buildings, pretty good to have fire siphons, but the fact that you're lacking in terms of range siege is something that hurts you. And it is nice to have, like, even Norse rams are more useful in a lot of ways than destroyers. Obviously, they're slow, they cost a lot of resources, and destroyers, you can use them, against armies, as opposed to rams, which, yeah, that's not a great idea, but I would say not having, like, some kind of catapult or a ram or something like that is something that does hurt the Atlanteans, from my perspective on that. But for all their strengths, and for all the trade-offs, for all the weaknesses they have, I think none of these compare at all to the biggest downside that the Atlanteans do have. And that downside is the fact that their tier 2 units aren't great. Or if they are good, like Ballistas, right? They're good against infantry units, even though you have some dedicated, anti-cav unit, anti-ranged unit with thermas, anti-infantry unit with Ballistas, though you won't be able to afford a lot of these things, and you shouldn't really spam Ballistas in tier 2. This creates a major issue. Your tier 2 is not strong at all. The only unit that's good in tier 2 is the Marmello. But everything else is kind of weak. It's only in tier 3, especially in tier 4, where you get that level of strength, where you get things like Contarius, where you get things like Arcus. That is kind of a big problem, because early game aggression is important. Yes, you can raid with Therma. Yes, you have an anti-cav unit. You do have that capability. And don't dismiss the range capability of the Thermas, because while they're not particularly great as range unit, you can't really, a lot of units won't catch up to them, and ranged soldiers will not win necessarily engagements with them. But they're not great raiders. They do have that capability, but that is one of the downsides from my perspective. I could be very wrong on this, obviously, but, compare Therma to Chariot Archers, even if they're higher tier. Now, Chariot Archers have, so much more capability. It's the longer range. So that is one problem. I mean, they're good, they're good counters against specific units, don't get me wrong, but the fact that the general purpose units are locked behind tier 3, the Cav and, Arcus, and then the fact that your Fanatics are tier 4 unit, that does actually hurt you. Because it means you're more reliant, and this is my perspective, you're more reliant on getting to tier 4 or to tier 3 than other civilizations. You can talk about the Egyptians. That's a fair point. That is a problem that the Egyptians do absolutely have. There is, however, a crucial difference between you and Egyptians, though. That the Egyptians have a much better economy than anyone else in the game. Even a Gaia Atlantean will not compare to the economic power that, Isis or Set do have. We can talk about Ra and all his issues. But, basically, if the issue for Egyptians is that a lot of their tier 2 barracks units are not particularly great and you need a lot of resources to mass them to make it worth it, Atlanteans have supposedly the quality. They pay a lot for that, but it doesn't quite work out, I think, in tier 2. There's more to this, actually. There's actually quite a bit more. Let's consider gods, because, god units can help make up for some of these weaknesses. Well, automatons are not great in a multiplayer game. Flat out, not worth getting. In a campaign situation, maybe. Okay, so automatons, not really worth it. Prometheans, fair enough. They're actually decent. They buffed them. It's worth using them, I feel. It's worth using a Prometheus is pretty worthwhile in a lot of ways. That is all well and good. But Oceanus, this is the problem, the tier 2 issue. Prometheus is the only one that gives you worthwhile tier 2 units. What about Oceanus? You might say, well, I'm not going to say Oceanus is a bad god, because he is not. In fact, I would dare say he's the best one. But you get the support myth unit. And yes, he buffs, your Marmellos by quite a bit, right there, Bite of the Shark and all that kind of stuff, right? That is substantial. But you are lacking. You are going to end up lacking in certain ways in terms of combat power compared to other civilizations. Consider the Norse, right? They have really good tier 2 units. Say what you will about the Norse and all their problems, like Valkyries, Trolls, Einhar. Einhari, those are good units. Or Draugrs, those are great myth units. You look at the Egyptians, right? You get Anubites, Wadjets, yeah, they're worthless, but Wadjets are worthless to be sure, but the Egyptians have Sphinxes, Anubites available to them, and those work. Egyptians may have a situation where one of their minor gods is not going to produce units. Atlanteans have the problem where 2 out of 3 minor god choices are not going to produce direct combat power. Again, Oceanus delivers, But is that inherent early game weakness they do have to deal with respect to the Atlanteans? That is a problem. And I guess some kind of rebalancing might be in order with respect to that. What do I know about it? On the flip side, you do have a lot of economic power long term. You do have a lot of military power long term. You have a lot of flexibility with siege. Not necessarily siege power, but you do have flexibility because you can use destroyer heroes. Like you can get a bunch of destroyer heroes to deal with enemy myth units, hold the line. They're quite effective at, you know, taking damage, and use them to destroy buildings. So, you know, an extra siege unit wouldn't go amiss from my particular perspective. But from my point of view with the Atlanteans, a lot of their power is unlocked at tier 3, and that is something that does hurt them from where I'm standing on that. Because a lot of the 1v1, like for team games, my conclusion would be Atlanteans would be amazing for team games, but maybe they're not quite there where they should be for 1v1 games. Let me know what you guys think. But, you know, if I look at tier lists, I look at statistics such as they are, and they're not perfect at the moment, it's clear that the Atlanteans are struggling right now. Like, you can talk, like, I've talked about the weaknesses of the Norse, right? But then you have Odin, who's freaking dominating 1v1 at the moment. For a reason. His scouting ability, his regeneration, his extra favor. Like, Odin does a lot to make up for any kind of inherent weaknesses that that the Norse do have. And maybe that's one of the things that's a problem for Atlanteans. None of their major gods does help with that. And in fact, like, you know, Gaia is just solidifying kind of the issue. Kronos has more offensive power, to be certain, but he's not necessarily fixing the problems either. So that is a bit of an issue, because like Kronos, he's great in aggressiveness aspect, but inherently the race is kind of holding him back, and that is an issue. Costin signing out.